Hello everyone. My research is to public versus private sector on urban public space performance in terms of user perception in city of Colombo. So these are the content of my research presentation. When we move to the what is public space question, so there are controversial definitions for public spaces which evolved around publicly owned spaces and transferred to private sector owned space. The definition by researchers are public space owned by either government or private sector. Public owned space will be free access for general public as well as private owned for urban community need. It will be shareable, accessible as unity and or disagreements among public. The public space classified based on two categories by Johnson and Clover. The first category is public spaces. It's described as urban spaces accessible for public and fully owned and operated by the government agency or entity. The second one is a private spaces. It is mentioned as a special public space designed for specific and completely private group. The owners can determine the users with full restricted access. Based on that, you can have the question like, does ownership matter for public space use? While see the public and private space uh, appearance and facilities, maybe you can think like, are people rejecting the publicly owned space due to poor management functions or less attractive features in publicly owned spaces? At the other hand, in private owned spaces, does privately owned space a better alternative? So let's see. If we move to the research question and aim, the research question is how users perceive the publicness of urban public space in the context of privately and publicly owned spaces. And the aim of the study were to understand the socio-cultural and political factors determining the publicness of urban spaces and to evaluate the positive and negative impacts on users within each case study. And the scope of the study is to identify the public perception within access and ownership controls in urban public space in Sri Lankan urban context. At the same time, this study fully focused on qualitative data and analysis. This is limited to Colombo urban context due to the time limitation. The study covered ownership and access factors. So, if we move to the literature review part, there are controversial arguments ongoing with public versus private on space debates. In that case, urban public space provided by the private sector could decide upon the acceptable uses and users and behaviors. Such control measures have eventually entertained selected social groups for the full access to the urban space features. This is mentioned by Nimit and Sechmith. On the other hand, the privatization control the market economy and it use innovative strategies to manage public spaces. Finally, public sector promote public space for profit, but private sector create the public space for complementary service to get its benefits. So, what do you prefer, private or public space? Think about it. If you consider the local context, nowadays Sri Lanka experiencing new constructions of public spaces with private investments. For example, Fort City project, One Coalface, and the waterfront project. But in that case, the lack of study about urban public space within private versus public context is a main uh, main thing to main understand how Sri Lankan studies, Sri Lankan urban public space studies going on. So there are lack of studies in private versus public space context because of local research focused on green cover reduction, impact of city functions, and environmental, social, and perspective in this field. In Sri Lanka, private sector influence the users to use private spaces. So there's a question arises whether private sector engagement has positive implication or negative aspects. in Sri Lanka in urban context. So there's a need to answer such questions through this research. If we move to the methodology part, this is the flow of the research. In this, at the beginning, research question, aim, and the objectives and the determinant factors are selected based on the literature review. Then, case studies were selected for data collection, and the qualitative analysis method used to derive findings. And then, after the validation, the finding and the conclusion. So, when moving to the data collection method, the primary data were collected from the case studies, and the secondary data collected from the literature review. 35 semi-structured interview and 119 online questionnaire survey and direct observation are the data collection methods. If consider the data analysis method, there are three methods used to analyze the data. The first one is observation and the photographs to differentiate the context through photographs, and then content analysis using NVO software. This was the main analysis, and then Cobweb and space model to understand the user preference of case studies. If you considering the case studies, there are two case studies were selected based on the urban public space categories, which is mentioned in the previous slide, like public space and private space. For the public space, the gold face green has been selected based on the definition given, like urban spaces accessible for general public and fully owned and operated by the government agency. For that, we have selected the public golf screen as a public spaces, and then private space selected as Excel World Entertainment Park. According to the definition, special public spaces designed for special and completely private group. The owners can determine the users with full restricted access, and you have to enter with the paid tickets. For that, we have selected the Excel Entertainment Park within the Colombo study area. If we move to the analysis part, the first analysis is the descriptive statistics. For that, from the semi-structured interview and the online question survey were depicted almost similar outputs. In this case, gender and age categories were same in results. Nearly 70% of the users come under the 18 to 35 age categories, as well as visitors of public space equally shared in male-female ratio. Rest of the things, the age, marital status, and the company has depicted the relation between them in UPS provision. At the same time, considering the visit of both places, family-wise visiting and gathering were taken place at Golf is Green because of the easy access and identity of the place. If we move to the observation and photographic survey, you can see the public on space and the private on space is separated using the entrance, basic facilities, and seating arrangement, this kind of things. In that, you can see in the entrance, you can see in the public on spaces, there are open, structure is open for all, but in the private case, the there are some kind of physical barriers in the basic facilities. So you can say sanitary and the parking facilities are lack in public owned spaces. At the same time, in the private, those are upgraded. In the seating arrangement also, in the public owned spaces, the seating arrangement is lack. At the same time, in the private, the seating arrangements are much better than public owned spaces. If we move to the workload analysis to understand or deal near the user perception, you can see the comparative feedbacks and functionality of case studies by online and interview surveys. Most of the people preferred the food, shops, and play as a uh, main things in UPS. So, based on that, you can understand the restaurant shopping experience and recurrent spaces are wanted by people. At the same time, when considering the place identity of the urban public spaces, the highlighted words were family and friends, easy accessible, relaxation and enjoyment purposes, and shopping activities with safe and calm environment. So, you can delineate how people understand and prefer the public space should be there. If you move to the main and the important analysis, like it is cobweb and space ever model. In this, the metric coding query analysis method were used to prepare the cobweb model. In this case, you can see the positive and the negative side has been arranged in the right side and left side. based on the Cobweb model, private and public ownership depicted the user preference based on attributes. So mostly the positive side covered by public owned spaces. In that, common activities, no access restriction, and affordable are depicted as a positive factors. At the same time, in the negative side covered by mostly private owned spaces. In this case, less sociable, more access restriction, and not affordable are depicted. In Sri Lankan case, social segregation and responsibility are the main important factors. Uh, the, factors depicted. Uh, So the people differentiate public spaces as public or private owned spaces based on publicness. In this, positive and negative attributes. If we move to the public perception on public versus private owned spaces, there are two hierarchy chart analysis. Analysis has been derived from NVO analysis. In that, in the left side, golfer screen depicted in the as online influencing factors in public owned spaces are access, ownership, and feeling of safety. In this case, no access restriction and public ownership preferred by people. At the same time, safety issues and lack of facilities influencing on people's desires. In considering the Excel alternative impact in the right side, frontline influencing factors are private owned space in the private owned space, access, affordability, and ownership. At the same time, more access restriction and not affordable preferred by people to people, and but private ownership and enjoyment with safety influencing on people's desires. If moving to the conclusion part, the research aim. The research aim was to understand the socio-cultural and political factors determining the public urban spaces, to evaluate positive and negative impacts on users within each case study. So based on this research aim, we can think like how the positive and negative factors derived from public owned space and private ownership owned spaces. In public ownership, the positive factors are affordability, less access restriction, comfortable, and publicness. At the same time, the negative factors are lack of facilities for safety. In the private ownership, high safety and security, good facilities, good enjoyment, comfortability are the positive factors. At the same time, more access restriction, less sociability, unaffordability, less publicness are the negative factors. Since cobweb diagram reveal the publicness of urban public space through the analysis and differentiate the attributes based on the user experience. So, if just recall the previous questions, which is according to the research output, the answer is no. For are people rejecting the public owned space due to poor management function or less attractive features? The answer is no. Why? Because public owned space are not rejected by people due to those issues. Public still like those spaces because of less access restrictions and comfortable to use, but they need to increase the facilities and maintenance with better responsibility. And the next question was, does privately owned space a better alternative? So the answer is yes, because people think private owned space are owned by users because of the responsibility of money. So it will be a better alternative if they give the access to everyone and affordability with existing facilities with safety. If we move to the last part of this presentation, considering the publicness, public owned space revealed more positive factors than private owned space with some negatives. So the recommendations are publicly owned spaces are more inclusive in sense where every city user can enter or exit, enjoy and play without restrictions is followed by the general norms and conditions. Privately owned space provides safety, security, modernity, and psychological attraction for users, which is not as effectively as available in publicly operated spaces. And this next one is users prefer the control action by privately owned urban public space due to safety purpose and social status identification. And then Wolf Screen as an open public space was preferred by users due to minimum restriction for users at any time. On the other hand, private space have preferred by the users since privateness was more important for them. The next recommendation is private space can think beyond consumerism in provision of public space, which will be favorable for branding and marketing of spaces. And then finally, The cognitive behavior of people can be dynamic, so the expected facilities, behavior, and function of urban public spaces will be a temporal measure in cities. As a conclusion, we have concluded a specific point for the urban planners that urban planners and designers can focus on public and private participation models as a hybridization of urban public space through effective regulation and frequent monitoring of the outcome in pre and post planning stages. It is very important point to understand urban planners when uh, planning an urban space within the cities. As a future researchers required to assess the social segregation through privatization of public space from two perspective. The first one is what activities and utilities could be free and what not. And the second one is the management model of commodification structures as the role of state in regulating such spaces from beneficial perspective of people as users. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.